This video, you've seen how long it is. It's mega long, and sponsors like Vincero absolutely make it possible for us to make long videos like this. They require a ton of research, recording time, and production, so I just want to thank Vincero up front for getting on board with a super long video like this and really making it possible for you to enjoy. So, Vincero, summer is here, and for me, it's time for a change of style. I'm incredibly fashion conscious. Not really, that's a lie, but I do love a good watch. Now, I was really worried that Vincero sent me this new watch. This is a Vincero Rogue, and I was a bit worried that it was going to look pretty giant on my tiny wrists, which I've mentioned previously, but it actually, I think I can pull it off. It's big on my wrist, but it's not enormous. If you have normal sized wrists, like, 99.9% of people watching this video, you'll be totally fine and looking great with this Rogue. Also, what I particularly like about this one is it comes with this rubber strap, and we are having a heat wave here in Europe right now. You can see on my other Vincero right here that I had a leather strap, which you can actually switch out for a metal one, which would actually make this great for summer. But I'm excited to have a rubber strap because sweating into that leather all summer is not a good look. And look at this cool strap. You just pop that on there. All perfect. Vincero actually sent me a spare strap. This is another leather one, so you could swap it out on there. Like I say, they do have metal. It comes in a box like this. You can easily swap it out. And what I love about watch straps is that they can give a watch a completely different look. So you can see this is a brown leather strap or dark brown. This is a lighter brown one. And I really think just popping that different strap on there gives the watch a completely different look, which is a great way to change your style without spending a fortune. So that's pretty fantastic. So Vincero is all about the classic good look of a watch. They always deliver, and they deliver at a great price. Like I say, this is the Rogue. It's a chronograph. It tells the date as well, and obviously it keeps perfect time. Now, getting a Vincero watch is a great way to support this show, which is great of you. So why not check out their collection through the link below, and you'll also get 15% off, which is really good stuff. Just go to vincerowatches.com/brainfood, also a link below. That supports this show and it helps make ultra long videos like this possible. And let's get into it, shall we? While getting divorced in modern times in most nations isn't exactly a walk in the park, options at least do exist in much of the world, even in cases where one spouse would rather stay together. But this is a relatively modern phenomenon. Classically, getting divorced, it was almost impossible. So much so that at one point, about the only way a woman could manage to get a legal divorce from her husband was to prove in court that he couldn't finish the deed in bed by, if necessary, even attempting to have sex with him in court with representatives standing there to observe. For more on this crazy and fascinating and hilarious method of divorce, you can check out our video that time women could divorce their husbands by having intercourse in court. Yep, really happens. Perhaps not coincidentally, around the same time these impotence trials were going on throughout parts of Europe, a rather different means of divorcing one's spouse popped up in Britain. Putting a halter around your wife, leading her like an animal to a local market, loudly extolling her virtues as you would a farm animal, including occasionally listing her weight, and then opening up bidding for anyone who wanted to buy her. On top of this, it wasn't uncommon for children to be thrown in as part of some sort of weird package deal. Yep. While you might think surely something like this must have only occurred in the really extremely distant past, this is actually a practice that continued into the early, wait for it, 20th century. So how did this start, and why was it seen as a perfectly legal way for a couple to get a divorce? Well, it turns out that nobody is exactly sure how the practice of auctioning a wife got started. There is a mention of it going back all the way to at least 1302, where an individual deeded his wife to another man, but the next known instances didn't pop up until the late 17th century, with the earliest occurring in 1692 when one John Whitehouse sold his wife to Mr. Brace Girdle. However, noteworthy here is that 4 years later, when a man by the name of George Fuller sold his wife to Thomas Heath Maltster, Thomas was nonetheless later fined and ordered to perform a penance for living with his purchased wife. This was despite the fact that all parties involved were in agreement over the sale, seemingly indicating that this practice was not yet as widely accepted as it would come to be. On that note, the rise in popularity of this method of divorce came about after the passage of the Marriage Act in 1753, which which, among other things, required a clergyman to perform a marriage to make it legally binding. Before that, while that certainly was a common option, in Britain two people could just agree that they were married, and then they were, without registering the fact officially. Thus, without an official registration anywhere, it was also easier to more or less undo the act and hitch up with someone else, without officials being any the wiser if neither the husband nor wife complained about the separation to the authorities. Also, as a fun aside here, given that the clergy and other officials at this point were often unaware of things like the current marital status of two people, if anyone could show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace thing started. Not at this point in time a meaningless part of the marriage ceremony. At the time, the minister was really asking if anyone knew, for instance, if one or both of the couple he was marrying might already be married, or if there might be any other legal reason why he shouldn't marry the couple. For more on this, you can see our other video, What Happens When Someone Does Object During a Wedding, and Where Did This Practice Come From? In any event, after the passage of the Marriage Act of 1753 and up until about the mid-19th century, selling your wife at auction seems to have become more and more popular among commoners particularly. They otherwise would have no practical legal means of separating. The funny thing about all of this is, however, that it wasn't actually a legal way to get a divorce. But as the commoners seem to have widely believed it was, clergy and government officials for a time mostly turned a blind eye to the whole thing, with some exceptions. Illustrating both sides of this, in 1818, an Ashbourne Derby magistrate sent the police out to break up a wife auction. This was documented by one René Martin Palais, who witnessed the event and subsequently wrote about it in his book, Views of England. In it, he states, "In regard to the sale at Ashbourne, I will remark that the magistrate, being informed that it would take place, wished to prevent it. Constables were dispatched to drive off the seller, purchaser, and the woman for sale, when they should make their appearance in the marketplace to perform the ceremony, but the populace covered the constables with mud and dispersed them with stones. I was acquainted with the magistrate, and I desired to obtain some information in regard to the opposition he had endeavoured to make to the performance of the ceremony, and the right which he assumed at that conjuncture. I could obtain no other than this. Although the real object of my sending the constables was to prevent the scandalous sale, the apparent motive was that of keeping the peace, with people coming to the market in a sort of tumult would have a tendency to disturb. As to the act of selling itself, I do not think I have a right to prevent it, or even to oppose any obstacle to it, because it rests upon a custom preserved by the people, of which perhaps it would be dangerous to deprive them by any law for that purpose." Palais goes on, "I shall not undertake to determine, I shall only observe that this infamous custom has been kept up without interruption, that it is continually practiced, that if any county magistrates, being informed of a proposed sale, have tried to interrupt it by sending constables or other officers to the place of sale, the populace have always dispersed them and maintained what they consider their right, in the same manner as I have seen it done at Ashbourne." That said, the press, in general, seemed to have almost universally condemned the practice from the way they talked about it. For example, as noted in a July of 1797 edition of The Times, "On Friday, a butcher exposed his wife to sale in the Smithfield market, near the Ram Inn, with a halter about her neck and one about her waist, which tied her to a railing. When a hog driver was the happy purchaser who gave the husband 3 guineas and a crown for his departed rib. Pity it is there is no stop put to such depraved conduct in the lower order of people." Nevertheless, particularly in an age when marriage was often more about practical matters than actually putting together two people for the purposes of being happy with one another, there were a lot of unhappy couples around, and if both people agreed they'd be better off splitting, a means was needed to do so. The British commoners, having almost no other feasible way to do this, simply got inventive about it. Now, this all might have you wondering what rationale was used to justify this exact method of divorcing, and why people just didn't split and forget about what the authorities thought. As to the latter question, people did do that in droves, but there was legal risk involved. You see, at this point, a wife was in a lot of ways more or less considered property of her husband. As noted by Judge Sir William Blackstone in 1753, the very being of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is consolidated and incorporated into that of her husband. In turn, the husband was also expected to do his part to take care of his wife no matter what, and was responsible for any debts that she incurred, etc. Just as importantly, while a man having a mistress wasn't really that uncommon, should a wife find her own action on the side, perhaps with someone she actually liked, this was, by societal standards of the day, completely unacceptable. This didn't stop women from doing this, of course, even occasionally leaving their husbands completely and living with a new man. But this also opened up a problem for the new man in that he had, in effect, just stolen another man's property. Thus, the dual problem existed that the husband still was legally obligated to be responsible for any debts his wife incurred and to maintain her. He could also be prosecuted for neglecting his duty there, whether his wife had shacked up with another man or not. As for the new suitor, he could at any point also be subjected to criminal proceedings, including potentially having to pay a large fine to the husband for, in essence, stealing his property, as well as facing potential jail time. Thus, the commoners of England decided leading a wife as if she were cattle to the market and auctioning her off was a legal way to get around these problems. After all, if the wife was more or less property, why couldn't a husband sell her and his obligations to her in the same way he sold a pig at the market? While you might think no woman would ever agree to this, in most of the several hundred documented cases, the wife seemingly went along happily with the whole thing. You see, according to the tradition, while the wife technically had no choice about being auctioned off in this way, she did have the right to refuse to be sold should the winning bidder not be to her liking, at which point the auction seems to have continued until a suitable buyer was found. For example, in one case in Manchester in 1824, it was reported that after several biddings, she, the wife, was knocked down for 5 shillings, but not liking the purchaser, she was put up again for 3 shillings and a quart of ale. Further, there are a few known instances of the wife buying herself, such as in 1822 in Plymouth, where a woman paid £3 for herself. However, in this case, she apparently was supposed to have been purchased by a man she was having an affair with, but he didn't show up. Ouch. On that note, it turns out in most of the documented instances, the buyer was also usually chosen long before the actual auction took place. Generally, it was the woman's lover or otherwise the man that she wanted to be with more than her former husband. And as she had the right to refuse to be sold, there was little point in anyone else bidding. In fact, accounts exist of the after-party sometimes seeing the husband who sold the wife taking the new couple out for drinks to celebrate. Must have been pretty weird. Owing to many involved in such divorces being poor and the suitor often being chosen beforehand, the price was usually quite low, generally under 5 shillings, even in some reported cases a mere penny, just a symbolic sum to make the whole thing seem more official. For example, as reported in February the 18th, 1814, a postilion named Samuel Wallace led his wife to the marketplace, having tied a halter around her neck and fastened her to the posts which are used for that purpose for cattle. She was then offered by him at public auction. Another postilion, according to a previous agreement between them, presented himself and bought the wife, thus exposed for sale, for a gallon of beer and a shilling, in presence of a large number of spectators. The seller had been married 6 months to this woman, who is only 19 years old. Not always cheap, however. Sometimes honor had to be served when the more affluent were involved. For example, in July 1815, a whopping 50 guineas and a horse, one of the highest prices we could personally find any wife went for, was paid for a wife in Smithfield. In her case, she was not brought to market via a halter either, like the less affluent, instead arriving by coach. It was then reported that after the transaction was complete, the lady with her new lord and master mounted a handsome curricle, which was in waiting for them, and drove off, seemingly nothing loath to go. Perhaps the most famous case of someone among the wealthy purchasing an eventual wife from another involved Henry Bridges, the Duke of Chandos. It is not clear how much he paid, nor when exactly the transaction took place, but while travelling to London sometime in the 1730s, the Duke stopped at an inn called the Pelican in Newbury. It was later reported in an August 1870 edition of Notes and Queries. After dinner, there was a stir and a bustle in the inn yard. The explanation came that a man is going to sell his wife, and they are leading her up to the yard with a halter round her neck. We will go and see the sale, said the Duke. On entering the yard, however, he was so smitten with the woman's beauty and the patient way she seemed to be set free from her ill-conditioned husband, the inn's ostler, that he bought her himself. He did not, however, initially take her as his wife, as his own wife was still alive at the time. However, he did have the woman, former chambermaid Anne Wells, educated and took her as his mistress. When both his own wife and Anne's former husband died within a few years of each other not long after, he married Anne himself in 1744. The marriage was apparently a happy one until her own death in 1759. An 1832 edition of the Gentleman's Magazine concludes the story. On her deathbed, she had her whole household assembled, told them her history, and drew from it a touching moral of reliance on Providence, as from the most wretched situation she had been suddenly raised to one of the greatest prosperity. Not always a completely happy ordeal, however. There are known cases where the sale followed a husband finding out his wife was cheating on him, and then the man she was having an affair with simply offering to buy her to avoid the whole thing becoming extremely unpleasant for all involved or needing to involve the courts. It has been suggested this may be why elements of the spectacle were rather humiliating to the woman. Perhaps early on when the tradition was being set, some husbands who had wives that had been cheating on them or otherwise just making their lives miserable took the opportunity to get a last jab at her before parting ways. Not always just humiliating via being treated as an animal in front of the whole town, sometimes verbal insults were added. For example, consider the case of Joseph Thompson. He was reported his sales pitch for his wife was as follows. Gentlemen, I have to offer to your notice my wife, Mary Ann Thompson, otherwise Williams, whom I mean to sell to the highest and fairest bidder. Gentlemen, it is her wish as well as mine to part forever. She has been to me only a born serpent. I took her for my comfort and to the good of my home, but she became my tormentor, a domestic curse, a night invasion, and a fairly devil. Gentlemen, I speak the truth from my heart when I say may God deliver us from troublesome wives and frolicsome women. Avoid them as you would a mad dog, a roaring lion, a loaded pistol, cholera morbus, Mount Etna, or any other pestilential thing in nature. Now I have shewn you the dark side of my wife and told you her faults and failings. I will introduce the bright and sunny side of her and explain her qualifications and goodness. She can read novels and milk cows. She can laugh and weep with the same ease that you could take a glass of ale when thirsty. Indeed, gentlemen, she reminds me of what the poet says of women in general. Heaven gave to women the peculiar grace to laugh, to weep, to cheat the human race. She can make butter and scold the maid. She can sing Moore's melodies and plait her frills and caps. She cannot make rum, gin, or whiskey, but she is a good judge of the quality from long experience in tasting them. I therefore offer her, with all her perfections and imperfections, for the sum of 50 shillings. Not exactly an effective sales pitch, nobody bid for about an hour, which perhaps was further humiliating motivation for such a pitch. Whatever the case, he then dropped the price and eventually got 20 shillings and a dog from one Henry Mears. Apparently Mears and his new wife parted in, to quote, perfect good temper, as did Thompson. All this said, while many known accounts seem to be of people where both the husband and the wife were in agreement about the separation and use of the auction as a method of divorce, this wasn't always the case on both sides. For instance, we have the 1830 case in Wenlock Market, where it was reported that the woman's husband turned shy and tried to get out of the business, but Matty Maiden stick to it. Flipped an apron in a good man's face and said, "Let's be your rogue. I will be sold. I wants a change." She was subsequently sold for 2 shillings and 2 pence. In another case, one drunk individual in 1766 in Southwark decided to sell his wife only to regret the decision later, and when his wife wouldn't come back to him, he killed himself. In a bit more of a happy ending type story, in 1790 a man from Ninfield was at an inn when he decided to sell his wife for half a pint of gin. However, he would later regret the loss, so paid some undisclosed price to reacquire her, an arrangement she would have to agree to for it to have happened. On the other side, there do seem to be some cases where women were seemingly auctioned off against their will. However, for whatever it's worth, again, in these cases, by tradition, she did always have the option to refuse a sale, though of course not exactly a great option in some cases if it meant going back to a husband who was eager to be rid of her. Nonetheless, this may in part explain why there are so few known accounts of women not seeming happy about the whole thing. While it might be going to an uncertain future if a man hadn't already been prearranged, at least it was going to someone who actually wanted her and was willing to outbid other bachelors around town in order to get her. Going back to the legality of it all, at least in the minds of the general public, it would seem people considered it important that the whole thing needed to be extremely public, sometimes even announcing it in a local paper and or having a town crier employed to walk around the town announcing the auction and later sale. This made sure that everyone around town knew the husband in question was no longer responsible for his wife nor her debts or other obligations, and announced that the husband had also agreed to dissolve any former rights that he had to his wife, ensuring, again, at least in the minds of the general public, that the new suitor could not be criminally prosecuted for taking the wife of another man. For further legal protection, at least in their minds, some would even go so far as to have a contract drawn up, such as this one from October 24th, 1766. It is this day agreed on between John Parsons of the parish of Midsummer Norton in the county of Somerset, clothworker, and John Tucker of the same place, gentlemen, that the said John Parsons, for and in consideration of the sum of £6 and 6 shillings in hand paid to the said John Parsons, doth sell, assign, and set over unto the said John Tucker and Parsons, wife of the said John Parsons, with all right, property, claim, services, and demands whatsoever that he, the said John Parsons, shall have in or to the said Anne Parsons for and during the term of the natural life of her, the said Anne Parsons. In witness whereof I, the said John Parsons, have set my hand the day and year first written above, John Parsons. Witness, William Chivers. While none of this was legally binding in the slightest, for whatever it's worth, there is at least one case where a representative of the state, a poor law commissioner, actually forced a sale of a wife. In this case, they forced one Henry Cook to sell his wife and child to avoid the Effingham workhouse having to also take in his family. The woman was ultimately sold for a shilling. The parish did at least pay for a wedding dinner after the fact, so, like only 99.9% heartless in kicking a man when he was down. For much more on the nightmare that was workhouses, though, do check out one of our absolute favourite Brain Food Show podcast episodes that we've ever done, the Sledgehammer for the Poor Man's Child. If you search Brain Food in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, you will find that. In any event, there were also known court cases where the courts upheld such a divorce, though seemingly always jury trials. For example, in 1784, a husband tried to claim his former wife as his own again, only to have a jury side with a new couple, despite the fact that there was literally no law on the books that supported this position. On the flip side, there were many more cases where the courts went the other way, such as the case of an 1835 woman who was auctioned off by her husband and sold for £15, with the amount of the transaction indicating this person was likely reasonably well off. However, upon the death of her former husband, she went ahead and claimed a portion of his estate as his wife. The courts agreed, despite the objections of his family, who pointed out the previous auction and that she had taken up a new husband. Now, as you might imagine, literally leading your wife by a halter around her neck, waist, or arm to market and putting her up on an auction block, even if seemingly generally a mutually desired thing, from the outside looking in, it seemed incredibly uncivilized and brutish. As such, foreign entities, particularly in France, frequently mocked their hated neighbors in England for this very practice. From this and the general distaste for the whole thing among the more affluent, even in Britain, the practice of auctioning wives off began to be something the authorities did start to crack down on starting around the mid-19th century. As noted by a Justice of the Peace in 1869, publicly selling or buying a wife is clearly an indictable offense, and many prosecutions against husbands for selling and others for buying have recently been sustained and imprisonment for 6 months inflicted. In another example, in 1844, a man who had auctioned off his former wife was being tried for getting married again, as he was, in the eyes of the state, still considered to be married to his original wife. The seemingly extremely sympathetic judge, Sir William Henry Maule, admonished him for this fact, while also very clearly outlining why many of the less affluent were forced to use this method for divorce, even in cases where the wife had left and taken up with another man, stating, "I will tell you what you ought to have done. You ought to have instructed your attorney to bring an action against the seducer of your wife for criminal conversation. That would have cost you about £100. When you had obtained judgment for, though not necessarily actually recovered, substantial damages against him, you should have instructed your proctor to sue in the ecclesiastical courts for a divorce, a mensa, a thorough. This would have cost you £200 or £300 more. When you had obtained a divorce a mensa e thoro, you should have appeared by counsel before the House of Lords in order to obtain a private Act of Parliament for a divorce a vinculo matrimoni, which would have rendered you free and legally competent to marry the person whom you have taken on yourself to marry with no such sanction. The bill might possibly have been opposed in all its stages in both Houses of Parliament, and together you would have had to spend about £1,000 or £1,200. You will probably tell me that you have never had 1,000 farthings of your own in the world, but prisoner, that makes no difference. Sitting here as an English judge, it is my duty to tell you that this is not a country in which there is one law for the rich and one for the poor. You will be imprisoned for 1 day. Since you have been in custody since the commencement of the assizes, you are free to leave. In the end, thanks to the masses having to resort to such extreme measures as simply abandoning a spouse and never legally separating, auctioning a wife off as if she was an animal, and the aforementioned impotence trials, divorce law was eventually revamped in Britain with the passage of the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, finally allowing at least some affordable means of divorce for commoners, particularly in cases of abandonment or adultery. This, combined with the courts cracking down on wife auctions, saw the practice more or less completely die off by the end of the 19th century, though there were a few more known cases that continued in Britain all the way up to 1926, where one Horace Clayton bought a woman he then called his wife for £10 from her previous husband. And now for some bonus facts. In case anyone's wondering, while there are only a handful of known cases of it happening, there were a few husbands sold as well. However, as part of the point of the whole thing was for the husband to publicly declare that he was no longer obligated to his wife, and for the woman in question to agree to be wed to another man, with rights to her transferring to him, the auction of a husband didn't really make a lot of sense from a practical standpoint. Nevertheless, it did happen. For example, consider this case reported on March the 18th, 1814, in an edition of The Statesman. On Saturday evening, an affair of rather an extraordinary nature was brought before his lordship the mayor of Drogheda. One Margaret Collins presented a complaint against her husband, who had left her to live with another woman. In his defense, the husband declared that his wife was of a very violent disposition, which her conduct before the magistrate fully proved, that in her anger she had offered to sell him for 2 pence to her, in whose keeping he then was, that she had sold and delivered him for 3 halfpence, that on payment of the sum he had been led off by the purchaser, that several times his wife, the seller, in her fits of anger had cruelly bitten him, that he still bore terrible marks of it, which he showed, although it was several months since he belonged to her. The woman who purchased, having been sent for to give her evidence, corroborated every fact, confirmed the bargain, and declared that she every day grew more and more satisfied with the acquisition, that she did not believe there was any law which could command him to separate from her, because the right of a wife to sell a husband with whom she was dissatisfied to another woman who was willing to take up with him ought to be equal to the husband's right, whose power of selling was acknowledged, especially when there was a mutual agreement, as in the present instance. This plea, full of good sense and justice, so exasperated the plaintiff that, without paying any regard to his lordship, she flew at the faces of her antagonists, and would have mangled them with her teeth and nails if they had not been separated. It's also worth noting that at least some English settlers to America carried on the tradition there, such as this account reported in the Boston Evening Post on March 15, 1736. The beginning of last week, a pretty odd and uncommon adventure happened in this town between 2 men about a certain woman, each one claiming her as his wife. But so it was that one of them had actually disposed of his right in her to the other for 15 shillings, this currency, who had only paid 10 of it in part and refused to pay the other 5, including rather to quit the woman and lose his earnest. But 2 gentlemen happening to be present, who were friends to peace, charitably gave him half a crown apiece to enable him to fulfill his agreement, which the creditor readily took, and gave the woman a modest salute, wishing her well, and his brother Sterling much joy of his bargain. So, that was a long video. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please do let us know what you think of longer videos like this in the comments below. They're really long to make really long to make, just all the way through. If you want to support us in making these videos and all of our videos in general, please do go and buy a Vincero watch. These are great things. You can find a link below. If you use that link, you'll get 15% off, and it does us a favor. So that's vincerowatches.com/brainfood. And thank you for watching.